Brian Helfenbach. Give him a round of applause. Now that we have introduced ourselves to you, why don't you introduce yourself to us? On three, everybody give me your name, first and last. 1, 2, 3. Good. Now I want to know where you're from, okay? 1, 2, 3. Where are you from? That is great. Wonderful audience tonight. This is excellent.
I don't think they're supposed to be here. Right?
Really? All right. We have some special guests here on Liberty Campus tonight. They're going to be here tomorrow for Congo and for a tour, and they're going to be there in the Reaver Thomas dining hall for lunch. We've got a bunch of pastors sitting over here. I want all of them to stand, if you would, please. Just stand. Let's give them a round of applause for coming in to campus and to see the campus and see what your life is about and what it's like and all that. But it's a delight to have you here tonight. When you came in tonight, you should have got a brochure that looks like this. If you pull that out right now, I'd like to talk to you about this document. We at Liberty University and at the Freedom Center, we're going to be launching a thing called Freedom Center Society. And basically, we exist to connect Liberty University students and the standing for Freedom Center to create highly engaged Christian citizens in promoting life, liberty, and truth through biblical worldview. Now, this is open to students and it's open to the general public to be a part of this. And if you'll see all the information here, we're not going to go through it tonight, but there's a QR code on the back and our website. If you go to those and tell us that you are interested in learning more about this, we'll put you on the list and make sure that you get information concerning this. And in a moment, we're going to introduce Frank Turek to you, show you a little short video before we do that. But I want to turn it over to Ryan right now and let him give you a few words. And then we'll come back to me and we'll have a word of prayer and start our evening.
All right. How many people are excited about tonight? Yes. All right. This is awesome. We really look forward to this. And I just want to say, Glenn is the person who you need to thank who made all of this possible. So please give him a round of applause. Just a brief moment. How many of you attended this year's March for Life? Raise your hand. Few? What? All right. So many of you in this room. I see Jesse Hughes over here. Jesse, wave. All right. Listen. For those of you who attended the March for Life, I absolutely expect that you will be signing up for the Freedom Center Society. I want to highly encourage you to do it. It's exactly these kinds of events and many more that we'll be doing at the Freedom Center, and I want to encourage your participation. There are going to be many opportunities, both academic and extracurricular, at the Freedom Center. So you need to go to standingforfreedom.com to check it all out. How many of you have been to standingforfreedom.com and have seen some of our resources provided online, including the Theology, Apologetics series? I want to encourage you to check those out as well. We are also looking for students who can help to contribute to some of the content we're producing at the Standing for Freedom Center. That's why you absolutely need to sign up for the Freedom Center Society. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. We are thrilled that you are here. I look forward to meeting every single one of you at the conclusion of this event.
And out in the foyer, you'll see that we've got some tables out there from the Freedom Center. There's some swag out there and some free information. Please pick up all the free information you want. There's a Theology of Politics, several of those out there on different topics and issues that are current for the United States of America and saving our country. We want you educated and informed about what's going on. Our guest speaker tonight that we've chosen to bring to you is a dear friend of mine, been a friend for a long, long time. I spent 43 and a half years in Anchorage, Alaska, serving under our president as the executive pastor at Anchorage Baptist Temple. He was the senior pastor. And we would have Dr. Frank Turek up there, and our people up there just loved him to death. And he's a genius in his own right in his delivery and the information that he shares, and you're going to enjoy this tonight. So let's roll tape. You're going to see a video, and before we rotate, let's do this. Let's ask God to bless us and to oversee us tonight. Father, we thank you for your love to us. We thank you for what you did on Calvary's cross for us. Because of what you've done, we have salvation and eternal life with you. And without you, we are nothing. And we just thank you for all you mean to us. And we thank you that you give us the opportunity to gather in a place like this and to hear what your word means and how it should be applied to our lives to develop our biblical worldview and our biblical values. We thank you for the opportunity tonight. We pray for our speaker, Dr. Turek, and we ask, Lord, that you guide and direct him in everything he says and does, and in our Q&A and all of that. But we appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank you, Lord, for all these Liberty students. And I ask, Lord, that you would guide and direct them in every aspect of their life. All the needs that they have, you know what they are. And, Father, we just ask that you'd intervene on their behalf and fulfill all of those needs. For it's in your gracious and your holy and your marvelous name that we pray. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. Let's roll tape. Thank you.
Do you find homosexuality to be a sin? It doesn't matter what I thought. It's not my opinion what's right in the Bible. I don't think we ought to impose my morality. I don't think we ought to impose your morality. I think we ought to impose your morality.
Even the society decides what's right, or there's a standard beyond society that is right, and therefore you can judge societies by that standard. Which is your view?
Why, according to you, when God plays God by taking a life to control in the Old Testament, is it a moral outrage, but when you play God by taking a life to control through abortion, it is a moral right?
I can't be any more concise than that. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. That was it. Something that happened 20 years ago on Capitol Hill really shocked me. It got my attention. This man at the time was Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas, and he had a picture he wanted to show a senator in California. This photograph was of a 21-week-old fetus in the womb who had been spared abortion by doctors who operated in the womb to correct a birth defect. This is the picture that maybe some of you have seen. You can see the little hand coming out of the womb there, grasping the doctor. Here's a better picture of the entire arm coming out of the womb as the doctor operated to fix a defect in this young man whose name was Samuel, ironically, the same name as the senator. Anyway, Senator Brownback said, is this the hand of a person or just the hand of a piece of property? And the senator from California at the time was Senator Barbara Boxer, and here's how she responded. I am not a doctor and I am not God. I trust other human beings to make these decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have to be a doctor or do you have to be God to know that that's a human being? And by the way, what are lawmakers supposed to do? They're supposed to make these decisions. That's why they're there. We elect them to go there and make decisions like this. And yet she decided she couldn't make the decision. Well, actually she did. You know what decision she made? That is not a human being, because she was for what is known as partial birth abortion. You have heard of partial birth abortion? That's where you take a fully developed baby at the 8 or 9 month mark, partially deliver the baby, and then drill a hole in the back of the baby's skull, and you take a vacuum and you suck the brains out. And then you deliver a dead baby. And Barbara Boxer couldn't be against this. Maybe it's because she couldn't legislate morality. Can we legislate morality? We're going to try and do this in 5 steps tonight, ladies and gentlemen. First thing we're going to try and discover is, does objective morality exist? Secondly, but you can't legislate morality, can you? I mean, even if it does exist, who are we to say how somebody else ought to live? Thirdly, we're going to ask the question, should Christians even be involved in politics? We're always told we ought not be involved in politics. Then we'll ask the question, what are the most important issues in politics? And then finally, what are the top 10 questions you should ask somebody about politics and legislating morality, if in fact you can do that? And then if I time this just right, we'll have absolutely no time for questions. Now we'll have time for questions. You see we have the microphone set up here. Now there is a warning that I need to give you as we go through this material. The warning is I intend to be correct, not politically correct. Now, Unfortunately, politics is very sensitive for many people, and I'm not here to upset anyone, but I do want to tell you the truth as I see it anyway. And I like what the great economist Thomas Sowell, who's now 92 years old, has said about helping people. He said, if you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. We're not here to tell you what you want to hear. You can just turn on the news or go to social media and hear what you want to hear. I hope to tell you, hopefully, the truth, and you can be the evaluator and see if I'm telling you the truth. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through the material. In fact, I'm originally from New Jersey, which means what exit? What exit? Oh, just a Jersey City guy. Yeah. Bergen County, forgot about it. I speak at 150 words a minute with gusts to 350, okay? So you cannot listen in Southern, all right? You're going to have to listen faster, but that's okay. If I go too quickly, I'm going to send you the entire PowerPoint presentation. All you need to do is text this word evidence to this phone number, 855-909-0582, 855-909-0582. Those out there in internet land can do the same thing. In fact, I'm not just going to send you this PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format. I'm going to send you 5 or 6 others, okay? And I'll put this up at the end. We do have some books available out there as well. And I want to point out that all the proceeds from the sale of the books will go to feed needy children. Mine. Thanks for blowing my joke. Actually, it's not a joke. I got 3 sons. In fact, one of them is here right now. Well, let me just tell you about the oldest one. The oldest one is an intel officer in the Air Force up in Anchorage, where Glenn was. So he's reading your email right now. The second son is a KC-10 pilot. You know what a KC-10 is? The KC-10 is a big refueling plane that goes out and refuels other planes in flight. So what we say about Spencer is that every day he flies up to 30,000 feet, he sits around, and he passes gas. And here he is. There he is right back there. Spence, wave to them. He's just in town right now. There's my son Spencer. He's also a major in the Air Force, but he's about to start with American Airlines here, so he is bringing his wife and our 2 grandsons to Charlotte, where we live. So that's going to be great. Third son, not in the military, but he is out of the house, so my wife and I are now empty nesters. Yeah, it took us a while to get used to that. About 10 minutes. That's how long it took to change the locks. All right. Anyway, I'm going to put this up later, but let's get started. You guys ready to go? All right, the first thing we're going to talk about is objective morality. And let me ask you this. Are these things rights? Is abortion a right? Is life a right? Well, if you say one or the other, if someone in here says abortion's a right and another person here says life is a right, we have a conflict, don't we? Someone is claiming a moral position. Do I have a right to marry whom I love? Do I? Well, it depends. Do I have a right to marry my sister? Ooh. Do I have a right to force you to participate in my wedding? There's a lot of people out there doing that right now. Do I have a right to transition even if I'm a child? That's going on right now. If you say yes, does a parent have a right to bring up their child according to the parent's values? Well, what if the child has a right to transition and the parent doesn't want that? We got a conflict here, don't we? Do I have a right to live my truth? You live your truth, I'll live my truth. Doesn't that sound right? Well, no matter how you answer these questions, let me ask you this. By what standard are these rights? What is your standard when you say someone has a right to X, whatever X is? Where are you getting that from? The Bible. Well, what if you don't believe in the Bible? Constitution. What if you don't live in America? Do you have rights? Where do you get rights from? God is always a good answer at Liberty University. He took a risk there. Well, think about it. If there's no God, are there any rights? No, it would just be your opinion against somebody else's opinion. If there's no standard beyond us, that endows us with certain rights, then all you're saying is, I prefer this and maybe you prefer that. But it seems in our culture, we're inventing, I should say, rights every 10 minutes. Maybe a way of looking at this is this. Let me ask you guys a question. How do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six? That's when he throws it to the other team and the other team takes it back for a touchdown. How do you know that? What do you have to know that the touchdown's better than the pick six? What do you have to know? Not just a scoreboard. What do you have to know? Not just rules. You guys are sounding like Charlie Brown's teacher right now. Come on. The only way you can know that a touchdown is better than a pick six is if you know the purpose of the game. If there's no purpose to the game, you can't say a touchdown gets you closer to the purpose and a pick six takes you further away. You've got to have some standard by which to judge these plays. Now, think about this. In football, the purpose and the rules of the game come from outside the game. You know, when the Chiefs and the Eagles a couple of weeks ago were playing the Super Bowl, when they showed up there in Arizona, the field was already set, the rules were already made. They didn't make up the rules, right? Where did the rules come from? They came from the commissioner and the owners, and every once in a while they tweaked the rules a little bit. Now, the rules of football are arbitrary. They could be different, right? But they do come from outside the game. Same thing is true in life. The rules and the purpose of life comes from outside of life. It comes from the Creator, the standard beyond us. And He says, this is the right way to live. This is the wrong way to live. If He doesn't exist, there is no right or wrong way to live. Everything's just a matter of opinion. And yet there are many people in our culture today claiming they have a right, and yet they don't have any way to ground these rights. But you know, Thomas Jefferson did not ground our rights in the Bible, even though he may have believed some aspects of the Bible. Where did Thomas Jefferson ground our rights? In natural law, which comes from the same source as the Bible, God. He famously said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. And basically what he said, when a government doesn't secure the rights, then the people have the right to a new government. And the whole Declaration of Independence is all about the fact that King George was legislating immorally. He was taking the rights away from the people. He wasn't protecting their rights. And so Jefferson said, we need a new government. Now notice Jefferson brilliantly grounded rights in God, but he also wanted religious freedom because they came from the Church of England. They didn't want that. So he had the perfect middle alternative between trying to legislate the Bible and trying to just have anarchy or just human-made law. He said, we want rights coming from God, but you don't have to be a Christian to have them. They come from God. You don't have to be a Christian in order to experience or hold these rights. Now you say, okay, so there must be rights out there, but what if somebody comes along and says, well, there is no the truth, only my truth? You're saying you have these objective rights? Is that really true? What if I have my own opinion on this? Well, in order to deal with the question of truth, whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson. Right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand and he said to him, Colonel, I want the truth. And Nicholson said, you can't handle the truth. Liberty, he did not say it that way. That was completely lame. If he said it that way, the movie would have gone nowhere. You can't handle that. That's not how he said it. Here's how he said it.
The truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, let's try that again. I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Now that felt better, didn't it? Didn't you always want to do that in church? You can't handle the truth. Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. In fact, they say things like, there is no the truth, only my truth, or you have your truth, I have my truth, or there is no truth. Now, here's an easy way of pointing out why these people are actually wrong when they say these things. In fact, if someone were to come up to you and say there is no truth, you should ask that person a question. What should the question be? Yeah, if somebody says there's no truth, you simply say, hey, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Did I say that right? I know this can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough, because this is known as a self-defeating statement. What's a self-defeating statement? A self-defeating statement doesn't meet its own standard. A self-defeating statement violates the law of non-contradiction, which says opposite ideas cannot be both true at the same time and in the same sense. Now, how many people in here have ever taken a course on logic? Let me see your hands, please. Thank you, homeschoolers. All right, good. Yeah, if we taught logic in public school, it would be a lot better. But we don't teach logic anymore. And so many of the statements you hear in our culture, particularly in politics, are logically self-defeating. What's a self-defeating statement? Well, this is one. How about if I were to say, I can't speak a word in English? What would you say? Hey, you just used English to say it, right? This is a logically self-defeating statement. And here's how you can identify these self-defeating statements. You turn the claim on itself. Turn the claim on itself. So if somebody says there's no truth, you turn the claim on itself and you say, is that true? All right, let's just do a couple more and we'll arrive where we started. How about if somebody says all truth is relative? You've probably heard people say that. If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Yeah, you could say that, Sam, or you could say, hey, is that a relative truth, right? You just look at the claim and you say, does it meet its own standard? No, this is an absolute truth claiming all truths are relative. It defeats itself. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Now, it isn't said this way much anymore today. Today it's said, like I just mentioned, there is no the truth, only my truth. In other words, you have your truth, I have my truth, you live your truth, I'll live my truth, we'll all get along, right? It sounds so right, doesn't it? It sounds so Oprah. It's like everybody ought to believe this. There's just one problem. If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? You can say, is that your truth? Actually, if somebody says there isn't the truth, only my truth, you're simply going to ask them, is that just your truth or the truth? You see this statement up here? If you just ask them, is that just your truth? Well, if it's just your truth, why should I believe it, right? If it's not really true for everybody, if it's just your truth, why should I believe it? But if you're saying this statement up here is the truth, well, the first half of the statement says there are no the truths. Do you see that this is a the truth statement saying there are no the truths? Now, I know this is unpopular in our culture today, but there's no such thing as your truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There's just truth. I mean, if you're going to say you have your own truth, you might as well say I have my own math. I mean, imagine if Glenn asked me tomorrow, he said, Frank, you're going to be around here a few hours tomorrow. I need a little help around the house. Why don't you come over to my house? I need a little work done. I'll pay you $10 an hour. Now, Glenn would never do this. He doesn't pay that much. Anyway, so I go over to his house and I work for 10 hours. And then Glenn says, well, how long did you work? I worked 10 hours, so you owe me $100,000. And he goes, $100,000? I don't owe you $100,000. I go, $100. And I go, oh, no, Glenn, you don't understand. I have my own math. Now, what's he going to say? You're crazy. There's no such thing as your math or my math. And there's no such thing as your truth or my truth. There's just truth. Look, either human beings have a right to life or they don't. That's not my truth or your truth. It's either true for everybody or it's true for nobody. It's one way or the other. Now, you might get another objection, particularly if you're a Christian, and that is, you ought not judge. You've probably heard people say that, especially if you're a Christian. Jesus said don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrite? All right, let's leave Jesus aside for just a second. What's the logical problem with this claim? Yeah, if somebody says you ought not judge, you might want to say, hey, isn't that a judgment? Or you might want to say, if we're not to judge, then why are you judging me for judging? Right? You notice this is a judgment. You say, wait a minute, Frank, didn't Jesus say don't judge? Nope, never said it. Sure he did. He said it in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. It's right in the middle of his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. All right, I know this is going to sound weird, but it's true. Just stick with me. There are no verses in the Bible. There are no verses in the Bible. Do you think when Matthew was writing his biography, which we call a gospel, that when he got to that point, he said, here's chapter 7, verse 1? No. When were the chapter and verse divisions added? about 500 years ago to help us navigate the text, which is a good thing, right? It'd be really hard to find your way around this big series of documents without numbers. I mean, imagine you go to your church one Sunday morning, you don't have numbers in your Bible, the pastor doesn't have numbers in his, he opens up the Bible and he goes, let's go about 2/3 of the way in, let's see if we can find the same spot, right? No, you wouldn't be able to do that, right? You need numbers in order to find your way around. The problem is we tend to think if it's got a number in front of it, we can take it out and make it say whatever we want. We can't do that. We have to read around the passage. In fact, I know some of you are going to hate me for this, but that's okay. I leave tomorrow. This is why Jeremiah 29:11 is not a promise to you. What's Jeremiah 29:11? Well, you see it on mugs, you see it on pillows, you see it on posters, you see it on birthday cards, right? Oh, the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, plans to give you a hope 70 years from now. Who's that written to? It's not a promise to 21st century Christians. That was written to the exiles that went to Babylon in 586 BC. It's not a promise to us. I always ask people who quote that as if it's a promise for them today, why don't you quote Jeremiah 44:11? Why? What's Jeremiah 44:11? That's the promise that God made to the exiles that went to Egypt. And he told them, don't go to Egypt. You know what Jeremiah 44:11 says? I will destroy you and all Judah. You don't see that stitched into a pillow. You don't see that on a birthday card, happy birthday. I will destroy you and all Judah. Well, thank you, Grandma. That is so sweet. Why do we take stuff out of context? Well, what's the context of Matthew 7? Read around it. Jesus doesn't say judge not and stop right there. What does he say? Judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you'll be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite, which is a judgment, take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first so you can better help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It's actually a command on how to judge. In other words, don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, fix it, then go help your brother. But it would be completely ridiculous to say don't make judgments. Why? Number one, it's a judgment itself. And number two, you'd be dead already if you didn't make judgments. Right? Even since we're talking about politics here today, everybody on every side of the aisle makes judgments. Right? The pro-lifers judge that baby has a right to life. The pro-abortion people say, no, the mother has a complete right to kill that baby if she wants to. Those are all moral positions. They're both judgments. The question is, which judgment is true? So don't buy into the idea you can't make judgments. Everybody makes judgments. The only question is, are your judgments true? By the way, I will say this. You ever notice that when you compliment somebody, which is a judgment, nobody gets upset? You know, if you say to your best friend, I really love you, you're such a wonderful person, I wish I could be like you, you think your friend's going to say, well, who are you to judge? See, I've noticed that people don't have a problem with judging. They just have a problem with judgments they don't like. In fact, if you tell somebody something that's true and they get mad at you, you just help convict them. As Augustine said, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. For you military, that's Augustine, not me. Okay? We love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. For you military guys in here, and by the way, I was in the Navy for 8 years, which stands for never again volunteer yourself. You always get more flack when you're over the target. If you tell somebody the truth and they're shooting back at you, you're over the target. They don't want their evil deeds exposed. Jesus said, men love darkness rather than light. We often want to suppress the truth. I think that's what Barbara Boxer was doing. She saw that picture and she just said, I can't decide. But I will decide because I'm not going to vote to protect the baby. So, there is truth out there. There is objective morality out there. But you can't legislate morality, can you? Let's go back to all these things we listed earlier. Do we legislate on these issues? We legislate on all of them. Of course we do. The truth is, all laws legislate morality. You can't think of a law that doesn't declare one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. That's what they do. The only question is, whose morality will we legislate? That's the question. In fact, sometimes you're going to get this objection: don't impose your morality on me. Now, if you notice, if you put this in the right format, it's the same problem we had before. If somebody says, don't impose your morals on me, what question are you going to ask them? Say it. What? Someone had it over here. Thank you, Christy. That's right. Because that's what they're doing. If somebody says, don't impose your morals on me, simply ask, then why are you imposing that moral on me? Because that's what they're doing. Notice they're saying you ought not impose ought nots, but they're imposing on you their ought not standard. But why can they do that to you, but you can't do it to anyone else? Actually, the better answer is this. If somebody says, don't impose your morals on me, I think what you ought to say is this: these aren't my morals. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles who do not have the law written on their hearts in Romans chapter 2. Everybody understands this moral law, but many people don't like it. They want to suppress it. And quite often, we as Christians do the same thing, right? We suppress things that are inconvenient. That moral law is there, so I don't want to impose my moral law. I don't want to impose your moral law. I want to impose the moral law. So, everybody's going to impose morality. The only question is whose morality. Now, there's one objection you're always going to get when this comes up. What about the separation of church and state? You're a Christian. You can't impose this. This is unconstitutional. All right. We wrote a book 25 years ago. Dr. Norman Geisler and I did. It's called Legislating Morality. It has a different cover on it. A few of you have it in here right now. It's been reprinted. And we cover this and many other objections in this book. We don't have it here now. You can get it on Amazon or our website. But the bottom line is, first of all, the First Amendment does not separate church and state. I'm not going to get into why, because it doesn't really matter. Let's say the First Amendment does separate church and state. It doesn't, but let's say it does. It's irrelevant. Because we're not trying to legislate religion. We're not trying to tell people how, when, where, if to worship. We're not trying to tell people what sort of religious rites or rituals they need to engage in. We're not telling them they have to be part of a church or any of that. But we are telling people how they ought to treat one another. And that's what all laws do. We're not legislating religion, but we are legislating morality. Now, if there's a small group of people out there that want to legislate the Old Testament, count me out. The Old Testament was just for ancient Israel. The Bible even says that. That's why Jefferson comes along and he goes, that's not how we ought to legislate. We ought not have a state church, but we have to have a state morality. And our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence in particular, is grounded in God. That's where it comes from. We're not legislating religion. We are legislating morality, and that's what everybody's trying to do. On all sides of the aisle, everybody's trying to legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality? All right. Number 3, should Christians be involved in politics? I only have 2 questions on this, and I want to ask you what your response is to each of them, because I know a lot of Christians say we ought not be involved. Okay, first question. Should Christians care how people are treated? Yes. Does anybody disagree with that? Could anybody disagree with that? We're supposed to care for our fellow man, right? Second question. Should Christians care how people are treated by their government? Yes. Duh. So yeah, you ought to be involved in politics then. Because if you care how people are treated, you ought to care how governments treat people. In fact, who has done more evil than any other group? The government. Look at the last century. How many people were killed by governments in the last century? Estimates are 100 million. From Mao to Stalin to Hitler to Pol Pot. They're killed by governments. And we're not supposed to care about those things? Really? Of course we're supposed to care. Of course we're supposed to be involved. If we're not involved, are only atheists qualified to run the country? Where do we get that from? So from a logical perspective, we have to be involved. From a very practical perspective, we have to be involved too. Does anyone know what this is? That's the Korean Peninsula, right? South Korea right here. We fought a war over this line right here, 38th parallel. Look at South Korea. And now look at North Korea. South Korea obviously has a lot of prosperity. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. There's one major reason for the difference between South and North Korea. What is it? It's not electricity. It's politics. The South has political freedom. The North does not. Here's my question. Which country would you rather live in? Oh, you'd rather live in South Korea? Then you better be involved politically. Because there are some people that want to make it like North Korea. There are some people that want to take away all sorts of freedoms and tell you what you can and can't do in areas that they should not tell you where you can and can't do. We have to tell people what they can and can't do on certain moral issues, but not on every issue. North Korea is totalitarian. And our country appears to be sliding that way. It's a long way from that, but when censorship becomes very popular, when people can't express themselves without fear of being doxxed or fired or in some way punished, we're heading toward totalitarianism. That's why you have to be involved. In fact, politics affects almost every aspect of your life, if you think about it. The rules that are made in Washington, in Richmond, in your localities, affect almost every aspect of your life. Politics affects your church, your family, your health, your money, your business, your freedom, your property, your school, your safety, the poor, the unborn, evangelism, your faith behavior, everyone and everywhere. What do you mean your faith behavior? What does that mean? Do you realize there are people that can't live out their faith in society, particularly now when it comes to issues like same-sex weddings? If you're a photographer, if you're a baker, if you're somebody that serves the wedding industry, you will be forced, at the risk of losing your job, to do certain things that your faith tells you you can't do. So much for tolerance, so much for inclusion, so much for diversity, and our ability to evangelize. I hear pastors saying, oh, I just preach the gospel. I don't get involved politically. Newsflash, if you think the gospel is important, you better think politics are important. Why? Because politics affects your ability to preach and live the gospel. If you don't think so, why don't you go to North Korea and try setting up Liberty University? Can you do it? Can you do it in Saudi Arabia? In fact, I've been to Saudi Arabia, Iran, China. You can't do what we're doing in this room legally in those places. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. And we're asleep at the switch here in America. We think, well, we've got this Constitution. Nobody can take these rights away from us. Au contraire. What did Franklin famously say to the lady after the Constitutional Convention? Franklin was asked, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government did you give us? And Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. We better be involved, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what is the purpose of government according to the Bible? And according to common sense, what's the purpose of government? Paul talks about it in Romans 13. Government is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. In other words, good governments protect their citizens from evil. That's what governments are supposed to do. And I think the pithiest thing I've ever seen about government and human nature in one sentence was said by James Madison in Federalist 51. The guy who wrote the Constitution, by the way, was James Madison, the Bill of Rights anyway. People always look to Thomas Jefferson to figure out what the First Amendment says, you know, separation of church and state. Where was Thomas Jefferson in 1791 when the First Amendment was ratified? Anyone? Any historians? He's in France. He's an ambassador. They weren't texting him, hey, Tom, what do you think about this? No. The guy that wrote the First Amendment was James Madison. And here's what Madison said about government. Here's what Madison said about human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Why do we have three branches of government? Because men are not angels. You need to put checks on power. Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. We have to have checks. By the way, these branches are not co-equal. What's supposed to be the strongest branch? The legislature. Why? Because the legislature is closest to the people. The legislature can impeach the other two branches, but the other two branches can't impeach the legislature. So if you really want to see why our country has gone wrong, you can go to the Congress, because the Congress can correct everything, but it doesn't. And why doesn't the Congress correct everything? Because the people don't demand it. And why don't the people demand it? Because the church has been silent. We're the problem. Thanks, Mom. In fact, he's of course agreeing with Jeremiah, who said, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? In fact, the Babylon Bee just cited a study recently to show you the evil that humanity is all about. Study finds 100% of men would eat any fruit given to them by a naked woman. You think you would have done better than Adam? No, you wouldn't. You're just as evil as he was. In fact, let's take a macro view of Christians in politics for 2,000 years. Do you realize that Christians got rid of slavery, gladiatorial combat, death games, temple prostitution, kidnapped brides, wives as property, infanticide, child labor, child marriage, child sex abuse, child prostitution, and class distinctions? Christians did all this. And by the way, is there anybody in the Bible involved in politics? Yes! All of these people were involved politically to influence their governments. Joseph, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther, Nahum, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, John the Baptist, Paul, and Jesus. Jesus was involved in politics? Yes. In fact, who did Jesus go after the most? And who were the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the Pharisees were the religious and political leaders of Israel. Rome delegated much of the day-to-day legal authority to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And who was on the Sanhedrin? Some of them were Pharisees. They were the politicians. They were making laws, and Jesus went after them. In fact, in one exchange, check out what Jesus said. This is Jesus against the politicians. This is Matthew 23. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Sweet and gentle Jesus said this? Yes, Jesus was not Barney, okay? Jesus was tough. Notice, he's saying you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You know, in our country, we're telling people what light bulbs they can and can't use, but we won't say, don't murder your children. Are we neglecting the weightier matters of the law? Yeah, this convicts us as well. Jesus was involved in politics, yes. Well, what are the more important matters of the law then? This is point 4. Well, Jesus, actually, I can't go through all the passages here, but you'll recognize some of the phraseology. Jesus talked about the greatest commandment: greater love, greater sin, greater judgment, greater knowledge equals a greater punishment, and the more important matters of the law. We just saw that passage. What does this imply? It implies a moral hierarchy, that everything isn't equally important. Some things are more important than other things. That's why Jesus said you're neglecting the more important matters of the law. So in our country, what are the more important matters of the law? What are they? I mean, does abortion trump everything else? Are you a one-issue voter? Probably heard that, right? I only care about babies before they're born. You hear that too, right? What are the more important matters of the law? Well, let me ask you this. What do you think Jesus thinks about little Samuel in the womb? Does he think it's a woman's right to destroy that baby? How could he? Do you realize in Luke chapter 1, when Mary goes to see Elizabeth, who's Elizabeth pregnant with? John the Baptist. And Mary has Jesus at just maybe a month after fertilization. And what does this text say when Mary gets in to see Elizabeth? Elizabeth says, "The baby in my womb leapt for joy." What's in a womb? A baby. And we don't even need the Bible to tell us this. We already know there's not a squirrel in there. Okay? There's not an aardvark in a woman's tummy. There's a baby in there. And if we had the laws in Palestine or in Israel 2,000 years ago, Mary could have killed Jesus. Jesus is not obviously for abortion. So, are you a one-issue voter? Let me say this. The right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. I think it is the essential, highest issue of our time. Does that make you a one-issue voter? No. I want my candidates to be good on other issues as well. But in my view, pro-life is an essential. In other words, being pro-life doesn't necessarily qualify someone as a good candidate. If the guy or gal is pro-life, but they're terrible on everything else, they're not a good candidate. However, being pro-abortion necessarily disqualifies someone as a good candidate. So, I'm not a one-issue voter, but I am a one-issue disqualifier. If you can't see that the right to life is the right to all other rights, I can't trust you on anything else. Thank you, Glenn. I'm taking you with me everywhere. Now, there are other issues. I won't have time to cover them all tonight, but I want to mention one other issue. Freedom of religion and speech are being lost in our country. In fact, I want to show you a headline. Actually, this headline goes back to 2011. Here it is. Christian consultant fired by Bank of America over gay marriage book. Just months after being fired from Cisco Systems in California over an anti-gay marriage book, Christian consultant Dr. Frank Turek, was also given the boot from Bank of America. Yeah, back in 2008, I wrote this book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, How Same-Sex Marriage Hurts Everyone. And I was doing training in these companies, leadership training, team building training, that kind of stuff. This, of course, was not the subject of any of the training. Yet, I was fired by both Cisco and Bank of America because someone discovered I had written these books. And when I asked the HR directors at these institutions, particularly the one at Cisco, I said, "Can you define what inclusion, tolerance, and diversity means for me? Because why am I being excluded and not tolerated for holding a diverse view?" Well, she couldn't give me anything but platitudes. So we decided to go public with it. My friend Mike Adams wrote the first column on it called The Cisco Kid. And then I wrote a column called Sex at Work. Do not Google that, by the way. Do not Google sex at work. You'll wind up at Bill Clinton's website, okay? Don't Google that. Go to crossexamine.org and go to the search button there and type in sex at work, and you'll see the article. I tell the story of how this happened. How could it be that somebody who thinks that marriage should be between a man and a woman is somehow not tolerated? In fact, I said to her, "Look, I work with people of all different sexual orientations, and I treat them with respect because they're made in the image of God. But don't tell me I have to agree with their sexual life. They don't have to agree with mine either. So why are we even talking about this at work? Are we supposed to have sex at work? I mean, why is corporate America obsessed with this? What's the point? To make widgets, do we all have to agree that certain sexual practices are acceptable? Why? What's the point? Because it's a political agenda. It has nothing to do with workplace productivity. You're going to tell everybody they have to have certain political and moral views to work? Really? Our freedoms are going away, ladies and gentlemen. We should treat everybody, regardless of what they think about their sex life or regardless of what they do. We got to treat them with respect because they're made in the image of God, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with them. And it doesn't mean they have to agree with us either. I thought this was a free country. Isn't it? Maybe not much anymore. And whose fault is that? By the way, it's not the LGBTQ community that gave us same-sex marriage. You know who gave us same-sex marriage? We did. Church did. Why? Because the church 50 years ago bought into the idea that marriage is just about an emotional romantic connection between two people. Well, if marriage is just an emotional romantic connection between two people, then why does it have to be a man and a woman? Why not two men or two women, or why not even more than that? In fact, if marriage has nothing to do with children, then marriage can be genderless. And that's what it is now. It's genderless. Gender doesn't matter. By the way, if marriage isn't about children, what institution is about children? There isn't one. Does anyone know who started no-fault divorce in this country? Ronald Reagan. 1969, 1970, he was governor of California, signed a bill with good intentions. Oh, there were people caught in these bad marriages, abusive marriages. We got to make it no fault. That spread all the way across the country. Reagan later regretted it. And this helped people to think that, look, if things aren't just working out, then I can just walk away. The most important agreement in society can now be broken by one side without consequence. And whose fault is that? It's our fault. We blew it. We're the problem. And in fact, C.S. Lewis, as you know, was way ahead of his time. Just read the chapter in Mere Christianity on Christian marriage. You know, we tend to think marriage is all about love and feelings and all this. And Lewis points out that when you first meet somebody and you get infatuated with him, you think that's what love is. But when you go to the marriage altar, you can't promise to feel that way for the next 50 years. You can't promise a feeling. You might as well promise I'll never get hungry or angry again. You can't promise feelings. What can you promise? Action. That's all you can promise. You can't promise feelings. That's why you take a vow, right? You don't need a vow when you're all lovey-dovey. You don't need a vow when you're in the infatuation stage. Nobody can keep you away from one another. You need a vow when you don't feel like being around the other person. That's when you need the vow. It's not just a romantic affinity you have for somebody. It's the fact that you pledged yourself till death do you part. Because it's not just a covenant with them, it's a covenant with God and your own children. We're the problem, ladies and gentlemen. Finally, what are the top 10 questions you should ask on these issues? Let's just go through them quickly, and then we'll get to your questions. The first question I think you want to ask when somebody says something is, what do you mean by that? And this comes from Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. If you haven't read Tactics yet, you ought to get the book. It's a great book on how to converse with people. When somebody says something, you shouldn't try and refute what they say. It's their job to support what they say. So if someone calls you a bigot, for example, don't try and say, well, I'm not a bigot. You know what you ought to ask them? What do you mean by bigotry? What do you mean by being a bigot? In fact, I had that same-sex marriage advocate called me a bigot once, and I said, well, what do you mean by bigotry? He said, fear and intolerance. I said, that's not bigotry. Those are just two more words that need to be defined. Bigotry is having a position on an issue that you haven't looked into yourself, and you're closed to any education on this issue or any change. And I said to him, sir, with all due respect, if anyone's a bigot, it's you, because I've written an entire book on this topic, and you don't even know why I hold my position, and yet you're calling me a bigot. By the way, as soon as you ask somebody to define their terms, they're in trouble. Right? Because if bigotry means, well, you don't agree with me, well, does that mean you're a bigot because you don't agree with me? See, people use words to shut you up. Don't allow them to do that. Ask them to define their terms. What do you mean by bigotry? And then how did you come to that conclusion? This is especially effective when you're talking about issues related to Christian apologetics. Somebody says, well, I can't believe in the Bible because it's been changed throughout the centuries. First of all, what do you mean by that? What do you mean it's been changed throughout the centuries? Can you explain how you think we got the Bible? And then how'd you come to that conclusion? Have you investigated the manuscript evidence for yourself? I guarantee you the person isn't going to say, yeah, just last night I was up reading a book about the Byzantine line of manuscripts. Right? They're not going to say that. You know what most people build their worldview around? Slogans. They hear a slogan they like, and they put it together with other slogans, not recognizing the slogans aren't even true, and if they were true, they'd be mutually contradictory. And as soon as you question them on the evidence for the slogan, they're out of intellectual justification. So ask them, how'd you come to that conclusion? Have you investigated the manuscript evidence for yourself? And then you can add a third question. It goes like this. Have you ever considered that we didn't get the Bible through the telephone game like you may think? We got the Bible when eyewitnesses wrote it down, and we can compare all the manuscripts we have over the centuries and reconstruct the original with more than 99% accuracy. Right? It's a way of you providing evidence back to the person. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? Okay. Now, I got a warning here. Well, you can use these questions for anything. Parents, you can use these questions with your kids, right? Like suppose your son calls you one night and says, Dad, I'm not going to be home by 11 like you wanted me to. Don't panic. Just say, first question, what do you mean by that? Second question, how'd you come to that conclusion? Third question, have you ever considered if you're not home by 11, you're grounded for 2 weeks? Be right home, Dad! Right. But husbands, never use these questions on your wives. Right? Because if she calls you an idiot, don't say, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? In my case, my wife has a list 37 years long. I mean, I'm toast. Spencer knows. I'm toast. So ask those questions. Third question, do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Why is that a good question? Because if somebody says, oh, what do you think about same-sex marriage? Or what do you think about abortion? Or what do you think about transgender issues? What do you think of it? Stop and say, hey, before I answer that, that's a great question. You mind if I ask you a question? Do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Well, of course I am. What are you going to say then? Great, because if I offer an opinion different from yours, you'll tolerate it then, right? In other words, you are setting a trap that they may step into right away. Then you can ask questions like this. Where do rights come from? They don't come from governments. They come from God. If they came from governments, that would mean that when a new government takes over and decided you didn't have that right anymore, you didn't have a right. That wouldn't be a right, that'd be a preference. And where does your moral standard come from? How do you make decisions on right and wrong? Do you determine right or wrong, or you discover right and wrong? If you determine it, it's just your opinion. If you discover it, it's God's nature that you're discovering. Oh, here's a loaded one today. Are men and women different? Just ask the question. If they say yes, okay, good. If they say no, then transgenderism's impossible. Why? Why is it impossible? Do you realize that transgenderism presupposes fixed genders? Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is in order to know I have this mismatch between my psychology and my biology. If there were no fixed genders, there couldn't be this mismatch. I also have to have some idea of what a man is and some idea of what a woman is in order to try and make the so-called transition. So transgenderism on one hand presupposes fixed genders. On the other hand, it tries to say there are no fixed genders. Look, a human being can only do one of two things: produce a sperm or an egg. There's no third category. Those are the two categories. Did you ever think we would be talking about this in a political context? Did you ever think we would? And this is not to say, there are people out there that genuinely struggle with gender dysphoria. But until 10 years ago, it was only one of every 10,000 young men who thought they were women. Now you have so many more girls thinking they're guys. And you know where this is coming from? Social media. It's a social media contagion. In fact, I've just updated the Correct, Not Politically Correct book. It'll be out in April. There's a whole new section on transgenderism. But you know who's making the most sense on this issue right now? I know you're not going to believe this, or maybe you will. You guys know who Bill Maher is? Okay. 20 years ago, I was on his program, Correct, Not Politically Correct, a few times. And he's a classical liberal, right? He's an atheist, classical liberal, thinks people ought to have free speech and all this. The left has left him behind. In fact, he had a show on last May called Along for the Pride, where he said, look, back in 1940, look how many people claim to be LGBTQ. He said, at this pace, if we continue, we'll all be gay by 2060. Right. He says, this is a social contagion here. Why are people in Ohio not doing this? It's happening in California, New York. In fact, with regard to the transgender issue, he said, are you telling me all babies are born in the wrong bodies? He said, if the world knew what it wanted to be when it was 8, the world would be filled with cowboys and princesses. He said, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pirate. Thank God nobody took me seriously and took me for peg leg and eye removal surgery. It's madness what we're doing to children right now. And tragically, look, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what has happened. The Biden administration, at the end of March last year, put out a memo that said, parents, if you don't engage with your child with gender-affirming care, if your 3-year-old, as young as 3, thinks he's a girl, and you don't affirm him in that, the government may come and take your child away from you. I'm not making this up. I can send you all the documentation. That's where we are. And whose fault is it? It's not Joe Biden's fault. It's our fault. Because we haven't been engaged. We're allowing this to happen because we can't get involved. We're just going to preach the gospel. One day you're not going to be able to preach the gospel. This continues. This university one day will be shut down. Church will be shut down. Because people are evil. And we're supposed to be what? Salt and light. Here's what Thomas Sowell said all about this. Ours may become the first civilization destroyed not by the power of our enemies, but by the ignorance of our teachers and the dangerous nonsense they are teaching our children. In an age of artificial intelligence, they are creating artificial stupidity. He's right. I don't even know if Thomas Sowell's a Christian, but he's smart, and he's 92 years old. He's seen everything. How about number 6? For what purpose is the government involved in marriage? Is the government supposed to affirm romantic affinity? Is that why the government's involved in marriage? No, the reason the government's involved in marriage is to perpetuate and stabilize society. And only a man and a woman can procreate and then best bring up a child so that child turns out to be a good citizen. That's the reason the government's involved in marriage. It's not to recognize that Bill loves Julie or Steve loves John. The purpose of marriage is to perpetuate and stabilize society from a government's perspective. That's why we should always favor the man-woman relationship over every other relationship, because it's the ground of civilization. I mean, think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. What would happen if everyone lived faithfully in natural marriage between a man and a woman? It's not traditional marriage. It's not just someone's fashion. It's natural marriage based on the biological realities of a man and a woman. What would happen if we all lived faithfully in that kind of relationship? What would happen to our crime rate? What would happen to our tax policy? What would happen to child abuse? What would happen to abortion? What would happen to children being left out in the cold? What would happen? Everyone lived faithfully in same-sex marriage. It would be the end of civilization. Now, I'm not saying a law that allows same-sex marriage would do this. I'm simply saying this to give you an idea of the reason that a government should favor the man-woman relationship over every other relationship. It's the ground of civilization. It's not bigotry, it's biology. That's just the way things are. Should we create new racism to fix old racism? That's basically what CRT is. That's a big issue. We don't have time to cover it here. Maybe we can do it during the Q&A, which is coming up here in a minute. We have on our YouTube channel a little over an hour talk on it. We have an entire DVD set or MP4 set called Jesus versus the Culture. But why are we creating new racism to fix old racism? How does that solve the problem? It just adds to the problem. Should children have their bodies mutilated and made infertile to address a feeling that's likely to go away by age 18? Do you realize that 80% of young people who experience gender dysphoria as a teenager, by the time they hit 18, they're through with it? If no intervention is made. And yet we have people wanting to cut them up and make them sterile for a political agenda? Does love require approval? Do you disagree with those you love? See, in our culture, we think love requires approval. Love does not require approval. In fact, how many people in here are parents? Right? How many people in here are former children? Okay, good. That's all of us. If your parent approved of everything you wanted to do, would that parent have been loving? No. You have to stand in the way of evil if you're a parent. That's how you love people. You don't approve of everything they want to do. And yet in our culture, we think, well, if you love me, you'll approve what I want to do. That's not love. The passage that everybody reads at their wedding, but nobody obeys. 1 Corinthians 13. First of all, there's no feelings in there. It's all action. And look what Paul says about love. He says, love always protects. Love rejoices in the truth. Love always perseveres. You want to love somebody? You tell them the truth. You don't do what Thomas Sowell had said here. We said it earlier. When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. You know, Jesus gave us one new command. Here's the one new command. Love one another as I have loved you. How did he love us? He sacrificed himself for us. You know what we do when we tell people what they want to hear? We sacrifice them for our benefit. When we tell people what they need to hear, we're sacrificing ourselves for their benefit. Why? Why do we tell people what they want to hear? So they don't get mad at us. So we don't get any blowback. But when we tell people what they need to hear, we'll take the blowback out of love for them. My first pastor said this, and I think it's good advice. What you should tell people in your life whom you love is that there's nothing you can do that will make me stop loving you. There's nothing you can do that will make me stop loving you. And because I love you, I'm not going to agree with you all the time. I'm not the standard of right and wrong. I'm not the standard of morality. There's someone beyond me. Final question. If they're talking about an issue where Jesus or the apostles have spoken, so you disagree with Jesus on this issue. On marriage, what did he say marriage was in Matthew 19 between a man and a woman? On sexual immorality, oh, Jesus never spoke about homosexuality. No, he did. Because in Mark chapter 7, he says, it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, but what makes him come out of a man, what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. And he talks about theft and sexual immorality and a number of other things. What was sexual immorality in his day? Any sexual behavior outside of the marriage of a man and a woman. It included adultery. It included fornication. It included homosexuality. It included bestiality. It included any of these things. He spoke about the category. He may not have uttered the term homosexuality or bestiality or any of these other things, but he talked about the category. Just like he didn't say felony home invasion is wrong, but he talked about theft being wrong, the category. So just ask people, so you disagree with Jesus on this? Oh, okay. Notice how everybody wants to have Jesus on their side? Everybody wants to have Jesus on their side. Well, I'm reminded of what somebody said to Lincoln when, during the Civil War, they said to him, hey, do you think God is on our side? And President Lincoln said, let's pray that we're on his side. That's the real issue. Unfortunately, even in the church, the new religion in America is more meology than theology. It's all about me, whatever I want. So, summary. Does objective morality exist? Of course it does. You know torturing babies for fun is wrong. You know slavery is wrong. You know racism is wrong. You know all these things are wrong. So there must be a standard of right. You can't legislate morality, can you? That's the only thing you can do. Should Christians be involved in politics? Of course. Everyone ought to be involved, particularly Christians, because we're supposed to be salt and light. And we have to protect not only our ability to live the gospel, but our ability to preach the gospel. What are the most important issues? The most important issue in our country is life. The right to life is the right to all other rights. Religious freedom is going away too, ladies and gentlemen. And what are the top 10 questions you should ask? We just went through them. So, again, if you want to get this entire PowerPoint presentation and many others, just text the word evidence to 855-909-0582, and I'll have some books out there later. In fact, this new book, Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God, is actually a fun way of getting young people and even older people apologetics, theology through the movies. So you might want to check that out. All right, let's go to questions. And since no one likes to ask the first question, we're going to move right on to the second question. Second question right here.
Hey, Dr. Turek.
Yes, Ryan? Okay.
Folks line up. We've got 20, 25 minutes for
Sure.
Q&A. So the first question is, so we're talking about imposing morality. And we, meaning the church, is the biggest problem. What do you see the biggest challenges facing the church right now?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the church. I know this is going to seem... There's a lot to unpack here, but we've bought in American Christianity to the church being a place for unbelievers. The church is not a place... not that unbelievers aren't welcome, they are. But the purpose of the church is to equip the saints to do ministry, Ephesians 4. And the problem is, we have a good impulse. We want to get people saved. So what we're going to do is make this place so comfortable for non-believers that nobody's even going to recognize what the gospel is anymore.
Yeah, that's good.
And which means we can't get involved politically because that's going to turn people off. So that's the biggest challenge I think that we face. We're supposed to get engaged and be Christians in all walks of life, and that includes politics. It's not our first goal, right? Our first goal is to get people saved and sanctified, to make them disciples. But one of the secondary issues we need to take care of is our ability to do the first. Because if politically our ability to preach and live the gospel is ruled out, that makes it a lot harder, doesn't it? Yes, sir.
So, sorry, this one's a little bit complicated, but I'll do as best I can to make sure you understand it. So, right now I'm having some problems with the Christianity because we all know this country is God's sovereignty, and if those Christians want to see this country to turn around, in my opinion, they should get involved with politics. So, what's the reason for these Christians not to go out there and fight against the evil? So, what's the reason for that? Like, how come they're not going to fight?
Well, one of the reasons is what I just mentioned. We think that we can engineer our services to appeal to the lowest common denominator, which means we never talk about anything controversial. And the reason things are getting controversial is because we're not speaking on them. Does your pastor ever talk about transgenderism? Does your pastor talk about covetousness? Does your pastor talk about homosexuality? Does your pastor talk about child mutilation when it comes to children being transitioned? Does your pastor talk about CRT? Does he talk about any of the issues that are engaging our culture right now? If not, your pastor needs to do that. And not just yours, I mean, in general. Just your pastor! No. Because we're supposed to be Christians in all walks of life. Yes, sir, go ahead.
The Bible says that salvation is confirmed when we confess that Jesus is Lord with our mouths and believe in our hearts. So my question to you is that, do you believe that we receive the Holy Spirit during water baptism?
If that were the case, if you had to be water baptized in order to be saved, is that the question?
No. I'm saying, so you, like Jesus on the cross, the guy next to him that Jesus allowed into heaven,
Yeah.
he wasn't water baptized, but he's in heaven. So his salvation was confirmed on his heart that God, through God's grace, obviously. But so my question is like, okay, a non-believer just said Jesus is Lord, and in their hearts, and
Then he's saved. That's what Paul says. He doesn't add water baptism to it. I think water baptism is a symbol of what he's done. And one of the reasons we know that water baptism isn't essential to salvation is because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, when there's a dispute among the Corinthians, are they following Apollos? Are they following Paul? And Paul says, were you baptized in Paul's name? He says, I don't even remember who I baptized. Or you were baptized in Apollos' name? I don't even remember. I didn't come to baptize. I came to preach the gospel. And then you go over to Romans 1, and Paul says the gospel saves.
Right.
So he's bifurcating baptism and the gospel. And if the gospel saves, and it does, then baptism isn't essential for salvation. It's something we ought to do as a public witness, but it's not necessary to be saved.
Right. But what I'm asking is, do you receive the Holy Spirit when you get water baptized?
No, you should. When you believe, you receive the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
And you're sealed with the Holy Spirit according to Ephesians 1. Yeah, and that too.
Okay.
1 Corinthians 12:13. Thank you. Yes, sir.
All right, so I'm pretty sure you could answer my question with like an entire other seminar, which we could probably arrange for. But about 4/5 of the way through Paul's epistle to the church in Rome, otherwise known as Romans 13, he writes, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So this is a verse that I hear people quote all the time to basically say that all the immorality, the abject degeneracy that's being legislated from the lowest levels of government all the way up to the chambers of Congress is basically God's judgment on us, which I don't necessarily disagree with. But how would you answer those people when they tell you?
Well, first of all, in our country, we are the government, right? We the people. So we're the ones that are supposed to be influencing the lawmakers to do the right thing. We're not just supposed to sit back and go, oh, they're doing bad things now. Oh, we can't because of Romans 13. No. We're supposed to be engaged. We're supposed to be the ones who call them to task to do the right thing. Romans 13 doesn't say don't be politically involved. It's basically setting up the fact that God has instituted government to protect innocent people from evil. But what happens when the government begins to do evil itself? What do we do then? And that's a thorny question. I think we're supposed to be civilly disobedient whenever the government tells us to do something God tells us not to do, or tells us not to do something God tells us to do. Now, it doesn't mean we're trying to overthrow the government. It means we're going to be disobedient. We're not going to do that. For example, if we're in China, and there's a one-child policy, and you're pregnant with your second child, you disobey the government. You give birth to that baby. If Joe Biden's administration comes into your house because your 3-year-old thinks he's a girl, you're gonna take that girl and hide her somewhere. I'm going to, because that would be evil for that to be done. Also, when you look at Romans 13, you've got to ask yourself, is Paul making a universal point with no exceptions, or is he making a general point with few exceptions? I think he's making a general point with few exceptions. Yeah, generally, governments are instituted among men to secure rights. But what happens when they go wrong? What are you supposed to do? I'm not advocating the overthrow of the government, but I am advocating you can civilly disobey. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Jesse.
Jesse, go ahead.
Thank you for coming. It's
Yes,
always
sir.
great to see people stand for truth. It's even better when they're from North Carolina. But
That's right.
my question is something I've been kind of trying to study a little bit more recently is the doctrine of the Trinity and just the whole idea of the Trinity. And I know that I forgot who said it, but someone very smart said, if you try to understand the Trinity, it will drive you mad. But something that I've seen, particularly from people of other faiths, particularly those of the Muslim faith, is they'll try and say, oh, so Christians believe in three gods. Oh, 1 + 1 + 1 does not equal 1. I've heard said a good defense about that is it's not about addition, it's about multiplication. 1 × 1 × 1 = 1. But I wanted to know kind of what your go-to kind of defense for the Trinity and the idea of God being three but one.
Three but one, yes. Okay, well, it is true that the Trinity may be beyond reason, but it's not against reason, okay? And that's important. We're not saying there are three gods. We're saying there are three persons in one God, and maybe the best way to illustrate this is to show you a graphic, okay? Now, there's no perfect illustration of the Trinity, but I think this one gets pretty close, okay? And that is, think of God as just the triangle. The nature of God is the triangle here, one divine nature. But there are three corners in this triangle, your Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, Jesus has another nature. He has a human nature, but it doesn't interact with the divine nature. It doesn't intermingle, I should say. And so this helps answer questions when it comes to Jesus, because people will say, well, how could Jesus be God when he didn't know when he was coming back? Did Jesus know when he was coming back as God? Yes. As man, no. Did Jesus get hungry as God? No. As man, yes. Right? So whenever you ask a question about Jesus, you always have to ask two questions. Are you talking about the divine nature of Jesus or the human nature of Jesus? You can also look at the Trinity this way. The Trinity is one what with three who's, but who two is one who with two what. So when you're talking about who two, you got to know, are you talking about what one or what two? Because who two has one what and one two. This is the Abbott and Costello theology here. In other words, there is a plurality in the Godhead, but there's still one God. Now, this makes sense to me. Why? Because how could God be love prior to creation? There's no one to love. But if there's a lover, a spirit of love, and a loved one, then you can have love. God was love from all eternity. A completely monotheistic being could not explain love. Isn't it interesting? The Muslims don't talk much about love. You can't explain love if you're purely monotheistic. Although I will say this. One of the sins of Islam is to put partners with God. It's called shirk. And they think, oh, you're putting a partner with God here. We're not. But notice that the Muslims think the Quran is eternal, along with Allah. Well, now you're putting a partner with Allah, aren't you? So in Christianity, God became a man. In Islam, God became a book. So the Muslims are doing the same thing, even though they don't recognize it. When I've had conversations with imams, by the way, they thought the Trinity was God having sex with Mary to give us Jesus. That's what they thought the Trinity was. So I love C.S. Lewis's point on this. He said, well, some people will say, why isn't this simpler? Well, you can make stuff simple when you're making up religions, right? But when you have something known as the truth, it might not be as simple. So I think this is a good way of looking at the Trinity. Probably the best chapter I've read on the Trinity is in a book written by my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, Answering Islam. So get that book and read that chapter. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Hey, what's your name?
Hey, Davis.
Hey, Davis. Go ahead.
Just wanted to start by saying loved your presentation.
Thanks.
One issue. As I sat through it, I couldn't help but be reminded that most people we consider to be intolerant would have already walked out the door by now.
Mm-hmm.
And these same people probably aren't open to answer even one or two questions. And in today's social climate, time to converse seems to be less of a luxury that we have. So how do we make a lasting impression on those who have little desire to engage?
One of the questions I ask people, you might know, is if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And I've had atheists stand at that microphone in front of hundreds of people and say, no. They say, no? Why would you not believe something even if it were true? How is that reasonable? It's not reasonable. It's not a head problem. It's a heart problem. They don't want it to be true. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God of their own lives. They're not on a truth quest or on a happiness quest. And here's the problem. You can make yourself happy over the short term doing a lot of fun but selfish things. Yet over the long term, it's a disaster. And everyone in here who's over 40 knows what I'm talking about because many of us have tried it ourselves, right? If you want happiness or contentment, you've got to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. So I think one way you can engage with people is to just ask that question. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Or if God really existed and wanted you to behave in a certain way sexually, would you follow him? If the answer is no, let's just go have pizza. Because you can't force somebody to believe something they don't want to believe. Now, when you ask the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And they hesitate or say no, there's 4 things you can do. Number 1, you can pray, obviously. Number 2, you can continue to plant seeds in their life. Number 3, you can love them, which doesn't mean you're necessarily approving of everything they do. And number 4, you can wait. Because tragedy strikes all of us at some point. And if that person's ever going to be open, when tragedy strikes them, your phone's going to ring and that person's going to be on the other end. They're not going to call their atheist friend when some tragedy strikes. What's the atheist going to say? There's no rhyme or reason to any of this. Suck it up. They're going to call you a person of spiritual depth. Because when the student's ready, the teacher will appear. And by the way, we shouldn't expect everybody to agree with us. Why should we expect everybody to agree with? People always ask me, a lot of people are angry with their questions to you, and you don't get upset. Why should I? Why should I expect someone who's 20 years old to agree with me at 61? I didn't agree with my 61-year-old self when I was 20. Why would I expect anyone else to? We're all on this journey, right? So you shouldn't expect people to agree with you. All you can do is respect them for being a person made in the image of God, ask the right questions, try and love them, pray for them, and wait. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Thanks, Davis. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Happens a lot.
Hey, what's your name?
Carly.
Hey, Carly.
First of all,
May the force be with you.
So, exactly, going along with the shirt, I'm a huge movie buff, and I'm also a film major. But I'm also in the process of reading Hollywood Heroes. I think I'm on the section about Harry Potter. But Harry
Potter. Go ahead.
But I also, in reading that, I also found myself becoming increasingly discouraged with Hollywood and movies in general, especially in this day and age, and especially Disney. But that's a different rant that I could go on about modern Hollywood.
Agreed.
But what would you say to, or what advice would you give to those who are going into the film industry and also Christians in general in how to approach movies, especially in the culture that we're living in today?
Yeah, good question. We need Christians in every industry, moral industry. You're going to be tested, though, as to how far you can go into immorality, and you're going to have to draw bright lines before you get in there. But if you can influence films for good, you ought to. And what we do in Hollywood Heroes is we point out the films that we think have stolen from the greatest story ever told, and that's the story of Jesus. And the common thread running through all these movies we get into is sacrifice. That's what people find beautiful, because it is. You know what people don't find beautiful? Follow your heart.
Yeah.
Actually, that's what the culture says, but if you tried to put that on the big screen, people would go, like, spoiler alert, how many have seen Endgame? Right? In Endgame, imagine if Tony Stark gets to Endgame and he's about to take on Thanos and he goes, guys, I'm just not feeling it today. You know, I don't want to take on Thanos. I got to get back to following my heart and taking care of just me. And then the movie ends. Would anyone go, whoo, inspiring? He turned his tail and ran. He followed his heart. No, he didn't go, that's terrible. The same thing is true in real life. We are inspired by people who will sacrifice themselves to save others. That's what Jesus does for us. So I think we've got to show people the good things that come out of some of these movies and show that if you love Iron Man, you're going to love Jesus. If you love Harry Potter, you're going to love Jesus. If you love Frodo, you're going to love Jesus. Because... Is Frodo here? There's Frodo over there, okay? All of these heroes in the movies in some way embody the greatest hero of all time, Jesus. All right? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Hello. My name's Hannah.
Hannah, go ahead.
Question for a friend. So in Acts, it tells of how the first century church and the disciples, they didn't have any, they didn't own any of their possessions as their own, and they shared everything.
Right.
Is it possible that they could have lived a kind of communist lifestyle?
For a short period of time, they did. Yeah, that's a commune. But the government wasn't involved at all. And it was voluntary. And then it ended. That's not a recommendation for governments today. In fact, communism has never truly existed anywhere. That means nobody owns the property, okay? The Bible presupposes private property. Why? Thou shalt not steal. Assumes you have private property, okay? But they temporarily did that, just like we might do if we had some big movement going on. Let's just all come to our house, hang out here, you know, you use whatever you want. Yeah, you might do that for a brief period of time. But that's not a model or a prescription for governments going forward. In fact, we have to remember that most of the Bible, and it's going to sound weird, most of the Bible is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. Most of the Bible is just describing what happened. And most of Acts is a description. It's not a prescription. They went here, they went there, they did this. Some of it is prescriptive. There's speeches, that kind of stuff. But a lot of it's just descriptive. And so we have to keep in mind when we're reading a passage that's prescriptive or when we're reading a passage that's descriptive. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
so much.
Anna. Yes, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
Is it David?
Daniel.
Daniel, close.
All right. So, killing is justified if it is self-defense. Is any other sin ever justifiable in any circumstance if it is used for self-defense or for any other reason? For instance, if you were hiding Jews in your house during the time of the Nazis, and is it justifiable to lie and say you're not hiding Jews if asked by Nazi soldiers?
Well, let me ask you. Schnell! Schnell! You open the door. Hast du hier Juden?
Hi.
You're supposed to say, I don't speak German, and close the door. Right? Of course you're going to lie. Why? Because you have a greater obligation to protect innocent life than you do to tell the truth to a guilty murderer, and there's biblical precedent for this. Look at the midwives, the Hebrew midwives. They lied about how fast the Hebrew mothers gave birth, right, to protect the babies. How about Rahab? She lied as well to protect innocent people. And in ethics, this is called graded absolutism. That when you're in a conflict, your obligation is to obey the higher command, and you're exempted from obeying the lower command. Remember we talked about a moral hierarchy before? There's a moral hierarchy out there. So if the Nazis are coming to your door, just like if Joe Biden came to your door and said, give me your 3-year-old, I'm going to gender transition that thing, you would say, no, you're not. Okay? Because you have a higher obligation to protect your innocent child than you do have an obligation to obey an evil government edict.
That's right.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, hi, what's your name?
Nick.
Nick, go ahead, sir.
My question is in regards to the penalties associated with legislating morality.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping in mind that the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8 is not in any of the earliest manuscripts.
Yes.
And keeping in mind that it is a descriptive, not prescriptive passage. My question is, how can you say that we should legislate morality while simultaneously saying that you do not wish to impose the penalties for bad morality outlined in the Torah, the perfect law of God according to the New Testament? If God determined in the Torah to have the death penalty for blasphemy, murder, rape, kidnapping, bestiality, homosexuality, adultery, cursing or striking your mother or father, witchcraft, and many other sins, and then how can you oppose the death penalty for every single one of these actions? If you reject the death penalty, I'm not sure that you do, but if you do, as many modern Christians have, what man-made penalty are you proposing to institute for those crimes instead of death that would be equally efficient? Should we not put murderers and rapists to death like God says, even if it makes us uncomfortable?
Well, because the Old Testament isn't intended for anybody other than Israel.
So when Christ comes back and rules with an iron rod for 1,000 years, he's not going to uphold the Levitical law he wrote?
He fulfilled the Levitical law already. He is our sacrifice. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know that the Bible says in Psalm 147, verse 20, that God has only given that law to Israel. Also, the writer of Hebrews, Hebrews 8:13, says the old covenant is obsolete. It's obsolete. Those Old Testament laws were just for Israel. Some of them are repeated in the New Testament, and those that are repeated in the New Testament are binding on Christians, but they come with different penalties.
What are those penalties?
Well, for example, when it came to adultery, in the New Testament, it's not execution, It's excommunication from the church. So the New Testament has different penalties than the Old Testament. Remember, the Old Testament's a theocracy. And the New Testament for the world is not a theocracy. And so we need to keep that straight. This is why some people will say, well, you Christians get involved in politics are trying to establish a theocracy. We are not. I'm not. I would no more support a theocracy than I would support the radical left, because that's not the way we ought to govern people. Not in this era, because as the Bible itself says, that was just for ancient Israel, when God was literally their king.
Can I have the verse that says that is just for ancient Israel?
What's that?
Can I have the verse that says that God's law in the Torah is only for ancient Israel?
Psalm 147 verse 20 is one place. You could go to 1 Corinthians 3 for more of this. You can go to Hebrews chapter 8 for more of this. Galatians, what did you have? 3. Galatians 3. In fact, that's the whole concept of the book of Galatians, right? The whole thing is about, will you guys stop trying to say everyone needs to be circumcised? Will you stop trying to say we have to obey the Old Testament law? In fact, the first church council, Acts 15, who's there? Peter, Paul, and James. And it says some believers from the party of the Pharisees wanted to know, do we have to obey all these Old Testament laws again? And you read what they say. They come up with this real short little letter. Just stay away from meat sacrificed to idols. Stay away from sexual immorality. If you do those things, you'll be fine. Farewell. That's it. Doesn't say you got to go through all the code in Leviticus. In fact, it would be impossible to obey the Old Testament today completely. Why? There's no temple. Where are you going to take your sacrifice? In fact, out of the 10 commandments, 9 of them are repeated in the New Testament. What's the only one not? Keep holy the Sabbath. Why? Jesus is our rest. Jesus is our Sabbath. We rest in him. He's fulfilled all the laws. We can't fulfill them anyway. I know it's going to sound weird, Nick, but it's true. Do you realize you can get to heaven by being good? You can. You just have to be perfect your whole life. Too late for me. How about you?
Too late.
Jesus was perfect. That's why we rest in him. Make sense? Okay. Yes, sir. Hey, what's your name?
My name is Devin.
Devin, go ahead, sir.
My question is, have you studied much into theonomy, and what do you think about it? Do you agree or disagree with
Theonomy? Like Rushdoony and those guys?
I haven't read in him.
Well, he's one of the Reconstructionists, another word for it. We cover that in legislating morality. No, we're not for it. That's similar to what Nick was saying.
Okay, thank you.
We're not for that kind of thing. That was a short one. Can we keep? We can keep going if you want. It doesn't matter to me. If we got to go, we got to go. But you tell me. Keep going. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
This might be actually somewhat related to the previous two questions in a sense, but because you made the right point that morality, or rather laws, are enforcing morality, and morality comes from God, who is the ultimate authority on that, how much then should a government, perhaps ideally, admit in their documents or things along those lines that the morality of their laws is being enforced because of what the Bible says, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I know this is going to sound a little bit odd, but as I read the Bible, God uses incrementalism. What does he say in, I think it's Matthew 19, he says something like, Moses wanted to give you, or let me see, hang on a second. Right here. That's not it. Stand by. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. Notice that because your hearts were hard, the Old Testament was actually not the ideal law for all time and all people. And God was taking an incremental approach with them. This is why, let's take the issue of abortion for a second, right? We had Roe v. Wade happen in 1973. About the time, 1973, we had a pretty good consensus that abortion was wrong in this country. All 50 states had banned it in some way. Now, 49 or so years later, now 50 years later actually, we're about split on the issue. What happened? The law is a great teacher. Many people think whatever is legal is moral and whatever is illegal is immoral. For the past 50 years, people could hide behind, well, it's legal, it must be okay, I have a right to do this, right? Now, to bring people back to a complete pro-life position, We're probably not in most states going to be able to say, okay, abortion, illegal. We're going to have to incrementally take them along. This is why, for example, I think Ron DeSantis was wise in Florida. He said, we're going to have a ban, even though he's completely pro-life, we're going to have a ban 15 weeks and after, okay? If he tried to say we're going to have a ban, complete ban, Floridians wouldn't have gone with it. But if he can move the culture incrementally toward a complete pro-life position, then he can save as many babies as possible. I'd rather save some babies than no babies. I know there are some people out there saying, we got to go for all or nothing right away. Well, if you try that and fail, you're saving nobody. So why don't you save some rather than none? Make sense?
I think so. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am, what's your name?
I'm Kayla.
Hey, Kayla, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great, but I'll get better.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'd like to return to your presentation earlier this evening. Last week, I had the opportunity to hear a presentation by Dr. Alan Parker. He was the legal counsel who represented Roe and Kano in the reversal before the Supreme Court.
The Dobbs decision?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I couldn't help but notice, as you spoke very passionately about abortion as a primary issue, you continued to put the onus upon the woman's choice. And yet, as we know from practical studies, the most recent of which was conducted in the 1980s, it's primarily men bringing in their wives to have abortions, bringing in the underage girls they've slept with. It's
Good point. Yeah,
it's the pimps and the Johns bringing in their victims.
That's right.
So, I mean, I could go on with a
I agree
continued
with
list of, great fervor. So I ask you, as someone who is very clearly well-versed in masculine ethics, to what extent do you think young men and men in general need to step up and take some responsibility for what has already been done and what they can do to change the future? Since very pivotally and most emphatically, the patriarchy, and I mean that in all of the leftist terminology, is not in fact a villain. It is in fact a great protector and benefactor for us.
Excellent. I agree with you 100%. Abortion has made men irresponsible and evil. Because how many times have men pressured women that they've impregnated to get rid of the problem?
Per the study in the 1980s, approximately 5 million in the first 2 months.
Yeah, that's the problem. So abortion not only hurts the baby, it hurts the mother, it hurts the father, I mean, in their own moral development, and it tells the culture that life isn't very valuable. So I agree with you. Men have to step up and stand in the way and say, no, this is not going to happen, not on my watch. But of course, that would create problems for people, and nobody wants to experience the blowback when you say that. That's why, as Soul said, we're going to tell people what they want to hear. So we'll sacrifice them, we'll sacrifice the baby for our own good. I agree with you. We have to speak more on that. Thank you.
There is also a distinctive biblical connotation and connection between blood, wine, and water. And I can't help but observe two key things. I don't think God, via Moses, turned the Nile into blood. I think he revealed the blood that was already there. And considering Jesus turned water into wine in the New Testament, and then later at the Last Supper said, "This is my blood." How many times have we as a nation gotten drunk on the blood of the innocent?
Thank you, Kayla. By the way, notice what has happened since the Dobbs decision, even prior to the Dobbs decision. We've gone from abortion being safe, legal, and rare to celebrate your abortion. Come to my state, we'll pay for you to get here, and we'll pay for the abortion. People are doubling down now on this issue. Instead of realizing how evil it is They are continually in rebellion against the truth. And the best description of this is Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. When you start to suppress the truth, God is going to give you up to futile thinking, to the point when you get to verse 32, people are not only doing evil, they're cheering on other people who are doing evil. And that's what's going on in our culture right now. We have to incrementally bring them back. Go ahead. What's your name?
Lucas.
Lucas, go ahead.
So Jesus was crucified, died and buried, and then 3 days later he rose again. But where was he, or more specifically, where was his spirit in between?
Well, many Christians say, according to 1 Peter 3, he descended into hell to preach to the spirits there. And others will say, well, no, that's not the right interpretation. I would probably say the scriptures do teach he descended into hell to preach to the spirits there, whatever that means. To say, I am victorious. What is that passage in Colossians 2 where he says he nailed the principles and principalities, nailed their, what does it say, Ryan? I'm trying to think of it. Spectacle of them. It's made a spectacle of them, nailing to the cross. I mean, what did he nail to the cross? I can't think of the passage right now. But that's what it appears. Was that the gist of your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir, what's your name?
My name is Jason.
Jason, go ahead, sir.
So this is, I'm thinking about it, sort of maybe a relative question, especially considering maybe the tensions that is building in the East between like Russia and China. And I guess what would you say is the balance between, obviously the issue of war is a bloody thing, you know, it's like a violent thing that you can't really, like, there's no good or bad, you know, it's a hard thing to kind of go through. So, you know, it's kind of a loaded question, and you can just, you know, I guess answer it however you feel. But my question is, as like a Christian, thinking about war, if it's not really justified as far as like shedding other blood, where would you kind of fall along that line of, you know, just following God's lead or his call to like enlist and go and fight? Or,
well,
you know?
Augustine talks about just war theory, and I don't think pacifism is biblical. I think that sometimes force is necessary. In a fallen world, force will sometimes be necessary, and you have to see if the given war is justified. Is it in self-defense, like we might say Ukraine is in self-defense? Is it to bring back peace? Is it using the proper force in reverse? It's not too much force. You know, is it trying to get back to the situation prior to the initial invasion? Is that what's going on? And you'd have to go through the criteria to see if that's the case. But look, God has established governments to protect innocent people from evil. And in the modern age, we have governments that protect innocent people from evil within the country. They're called police. And governments that protect their innocent people from enemies outside the country, they're called the military. And so they are necessary. That's the mandate that God has given us, that governments are there to protect innocent people. Now, sometimes, as we mentioned earlier, governments are the ones doing the evil.
Right.
And so that's why we Christians have to be involved to try and ensure that doesn't happen. But pacifism is not. In fact, Jesus even told his disciples, if you don't have a sword, go get one. So the question is, when is violence justified? And you've got to do that on a case-by-case basis, evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. I certainly think, let's just take a prime example. World War II was certainly justified.
Yeah.
I mean, from the Allied perspective. You know, when Hitler starts invading countries and bombing countries, what are we going to do? We're going to have to, in order to regain the peace and protect innocent people, we're going to have to take up arms against him. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Hey,
So before I get to my question,
what's your name?
I'm Cassie.
Cassie, go ahead. Yes.
So before I get to my question, I noticed something you said a few questions ago when somebody asked about Levitical law. You said that law was written only for ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And I was concerned about that because the question before that, I think you had quoted, do not steal. And I've actually studied this on my own and found that when it comes to Old Testament law, there's a difference between moral principles and legislative actions. So, like, I wouldn't say that the law was written, like, only written for ancient Israel. Like, certainly the legislative actions, such as the punishments for certain sins, were written for them. But I would say that the moral principle still remains because we know that God is unchanging. You know, like, in Deuteronomy 12, it talks about somebody prophesying in the name of an idol or following a false god, and it says that they should be taken to the gates of the town and stoned to death. And I don't think that, and I'm sure you don't think that that's necessarily something we can enforce on everyone today. But the punishment, of course, has changed. But that doesn't mean that idolatry is not wrong. Same with the Ten Commandments.
Right. Now, when I said that the law was just made for ancient Israel, I also said that some of the principles are repeated in the New Testament, and 9 out of the 10 of the Ten Commandments are repeated in the New Testament. So thou shalt not steal is not only an Old Testament concept, but a New Testament concept, because many of the principles of the Ten Commandments are universal, as you said, right? Mm-hmm. There are passages in the Old Testament that are not universal, the dietary laws, circumcision, those kind of things. Some of the civil laws for Israel was just applied to them. But the big principles go through, and those are the ones repeated in the New Testament. They're also the ones that come to us through natural law. So I'm not saying that everything written in the Old Testament, all the laws written in the Old Testament are obsolete, because many of them are again repeated in the New.
Do you believe that a principle must be repeated in the New Testament in order to be valid?
Well, not necessarily, but generally so. I mean, obviously there are principles. Look, everything from Exodus 20 to Deuteronomy is the law. All right, Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments, okay? But obviously there are passages in Proverbs which are universal, right? They're not just for the Hebrews, they're for everybody. But the law is the Old Covenant. And I know that, for example, somebody like Andy Stanley got into trouble for saying that we have to unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament. What he should have said, we have to unhitch ourselves from the Old Covenant. And he would be right about that.
I'm glad you agree.
Okay.
So the question that I actually came up here for, and I'll try to keep this brief because I know we're running out of time. So at the beginning of your presentation, you said that, I believe you at least implied that you believe parents have the right to parent their children according to their values. Is that correct?
Well, I was asking you if you thought that. Obviously, there are limits to that,
mm-hmm.
right?
And you brought up transgenderism
Mm-hmm.
as an example of that, and how we should be allowed to not have to affirm gender transitions for children. But there are also parents with bad values. As we know, this is a fallen world, and people have values for their children that are immoral, and they'll raise their children by that, and often that can even result in hurt.
Exactly. Like
child.
if I know you wouldn't agree that a parent ought to be able to abuse their child.
Right, exactly.
Right. Yeah, so I was just asking a broad question to point out there's a contradiction for people who say a child ought to be able to transition him or herself, and a parent also ought to be able to have authority parenting. One of those two is going to have to give.
Yes. So a very common theme I've noticed among many, many, many non-believers my age is that they were raised in the church with parents who were hypocritical, who claimed to be Christian, but then did not practice the instruction for families that God lays out in the Bible numerous times. And so they turned away from the faith because they saw it as hypocritical.
Okay, but
may I finish, please?
But let me say one other thing about that, and this is from John Dixon, a historian down under. He says, when somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame?
Well, that's not what my question was about.
I know, but
if you'll give me a second, please.
Let me just make the hypocritical point here.
Well, yes, I agree with you, but I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Don't you think the church has as much, as not more, of a responsibility to enforce morality and correct practices in families within the church as much as out of it?
Of course. Absolutely. That's what discipleship is. And that's another thing the church doesn't do. It never brings anybody up for discipline.
Right. And so I've also spent time in communities where Christians were very political, and like today's presentation, like, oh, you should legislate for morality. We have a duty to be involved in the government to legislate all of the moral correctness that the Bible lays out.
No. I never said that.
Okay.
I said legislate principles consistent with the natural law.
Right.
We're not going to tell people they have to get baptized. We're not going to tell people they have to have a certain viewpoint of certain religious issues. That's not.
Yes, and I'm
okay.
sorry I implied that.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, neglect to practice those same things in the home.
Yeah.
And so
they have to do both. But just because someone is hypocritical in their personal life doesn't mean they're wrong about what goes on in public.
Yes, but don't you think that families in the church should focus first on making sure that they are practicing morality before trying to enforce
They ought to do
on
both
others?
at the same time.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah,
But
both
they
at the
should
same
not be
time.
neglecting their own. If
Right.
anything, they should be correcting themselves. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, have a wonderful day.
Don't tell me what to do. You're putting all the pressure on me.
Uh-huh.
Gee. Thanks, Cassie.
Have a good day.
God bless. Yes,
Hello,
sir.
Dr. Turek. So I just wanted to ask you a question about basically what's a belief that you've, or I guess more like a theological concept that you've struggled in your life, and if you were able to resolve that struggle and how you did that and what that looked like.
Theological concept. Well, all the big issues that everyone has, you struggle with. What about those that have never heard? That's a moral question, by the way. You're implying God is immoral if he doesn't get his gospel to everyone. And so you've got to figure that out, right? What about the Canaanite situation in the Old Testament? What about slavery in the Old Testament? Is that the kind of slavery we experienced 160 years ago or something else? All of those issues are issues that if God, why evil? Right? Why does God allow so much evil? We know it doesn't disprove God because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. But why does God allow this evil to occur? Right? Those are all questions we all struggle with. So yeah. And I agree with William Lane Craig, who says if you have a doubt, you ought to investigate it and drive it into the ground. Just keep searching, keep reading, keep asking, keep praying, keep trying to figure out. You're never going to run out of questions, by the way. Everybody has questions. So you ought to just drive them into the ground.
Okay, and is there a specific example of one that you were able to resolve?
Well, the biggest one is, why does God allow specific evil? And just because I don't know why he allows a particular evil to occur, like say, why does he allow this baby to die? Yeah. I know why I don't know why. Because I'm inside of time and I see this much of reality. God is outside of time. He sees the whole picture. And there's something known as the ripple effect, that every event that occurs ripples forward to affect trillions of other events. And maybe a baby dying today ripples forward to be partially responsible for bringing forth a great evangelist 500 years from now who saves millions of people. Can I trace all those ripples? No, I can't, but God can. Maybe he allowed this to happen for a greater good later. So the ripple effect has helped me with that question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Is it okay if I ask 2 questions after this question?
That's one. Don't ask another one or you're done.
No, I said, can I ask 2 questions after this question?
Go ahead.
Okay. My first one is kind of a threefold question. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know...
what did you say? A brief what?
A threefold question.
Oh, threefold. Okay.
It's an elaborate question, essentially.
Uh-huh.
If you can find each one of the U.S. senators willing to answer your questions, would you go up to them and ask those 10 questions televised, meaning like either on YouTube or you could have it streamed to different platforms? But would you be willing to do that, or would you help somebody else to do it?
Well, that's why we're doing this seminar. I hope other people would do this stuff. No one person can do it all. And what senator is going to listen to me if he's not from North Carolina? Right?
A good one.
Well, no, every one of us in all 50 states ought to be going to our senators and our congressmen and asking questions and saying, well, why are you doing this?
But the reason why I ask it is because then it would be so the whole populace could potentially see it. So it would be more... it would bring out more awareness to those specific politicians as well as those questions, because then a liberal would want to see how Bernie Sanders answers that question.
From which of his 3 houses is he going to answer that question? I want to know.
Like I said, if you're able to find them, they're willing to do it.
If someone were to give me an ability to talk to senators, I would love to do that, but that's never going to happen.
Okay.
So it's just not.
And
the president can't even talk to senators, right? They march to their own drummer. But go ahead.
And then my second question, after that original question, that is going back to one of your previous questions. Would it not be right of the person that's in that household? We're going back to the World War II scenario with the Jew and the Nazis. Would it not be right to actually answer the question truthfully, because you're not only establishing it to protect that person? You might not just be protecting that person, but you might be evangelizing to that Nazi, and they might change their view based on your courage to stand up to them and tell them the truth, but also say that it's wrong.
Well, Augustine would agree with you. That's what Augustine thought. Augustine thought you ought to always tell the truth, for example. But I see instances in Scripture where that's not the case, and these people are still blessed. So I would take the 9. I don't have Jews, okay? So you can try that.
Okay. Thank you
for
your answers.
Thanks.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am.
My name's Ashley.
Hey, Ashley.
So I just have one question.
Uh-huh.
So I watched a video clip, and this pro-life woman was arguing that birth control is similar to abortion in the sense that it is preventing a child from being born. Some people think that no one should use birth control so that children that God intended to be in the world won't be prevented from coming into the world. As a Christian, what do you think about birth control?
Well, it's good and bad, and probably it's resulted in more bad, tell you the truth. It's made sex separate from children, and it's led to a bunch of promiscuity, but the cat's out of the bag, obviously. It's not something that can be reversed. It's better that we at least talk about being responsible with when we engage in sexual intercourse in the right situation. But it's created a lot of trouble, and so I even have affinity with people who say birth control has created all these problems. They're right. And now I know that's inconvenient for people when you say that, but it's right. It has. So
what would you say, like, specifically for like a married Christian couple?
Mhm.
Would you think that it's right for them to use it, or?
I think that's a matter of conscience. It's up to the Christian. It's not it would be what Paul would call from Romans 14 a disputable matter.
Okay.
It's not explicitly mentioned in Scripture. You know, he talks about drinking wine, eating meat sacrificed to idols, right? He said, if you have a conviction on it, fine, but don't put your conviction on somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think it's a matter of personal choice in that regard, your own conscience.
Okay,
All right? Thank you. Good question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So I was wondering what you would say to a person who wasn't claiming to be Democrat or Republican. They were kind of picking and choosing. Do you think that's wrong, or what would you say?
Picking and choosing based on the candidate?
No, based on just their beliefs in general.
About politics?
Yes.
Well, you have to go on a case-by-case basis and see, well, where do you line up here? Why do you line up there? One of the benefits and negative aspects of our political system is Washington is run by platforms and parties. So you could find, say, a pro-life Democrat and elect that person to the Senate, but you're actually not going to get pro-life legislation. You're actually going to create a situation where pro-life legislation will never get to the floor because that Democrat is going to give, say, the majority to the Democrat Party, which not only wants to keep abortion legal, it wants to pay for it. So despite the fact you're voting for someone that agrees with the right policy position, sending him to Washington is going to be counterproductive. That's just the way the system works. Whereas you might have a pro-choice Republican against a pro-choice Democrat, who are you going to vote for? For me, I already said that being pro-choice disqualifies that person. But if that person's going up against a pro-choice Democrat and the Republicans who are pro-life can get control and put pro-life legislation forward, then I'm going to have to vote. I'm going to hold my nose and vote for that person. Because that's the way the party, it's run by parties, it's run by platforms. This is why it was a ridiculous, well, know if I say ridiculous, but it was completely missed the point in 2016 when you had Trump going up against Hillary. Both of those people were distasteful personalities, right? But you weren't sending just 2 people or 1 or 2 people to Washington. You were sending that person and 5,000 others who were going to implement an agenda, which agenda lined up mostly with Christianity or the natural law. And look, I'm just going to tell you the truth here. I don't know how Christians vote Democrat anymore. Amen. I don't know how they do it. And I'm not a fan of the Republican Party either. I'm just saying, when you look at the platforms and you go, they want to pay for abortion, they want to mutilate children, they want to take away religious freedom, they want to use race to divide people, they don't want race-neutral policies. In fact, Biden just yesterday signed this big equity thing for the executive branch where they're going to try and equal outcomes. You can't equal outcomes. It's impossible without being unjust to other people. In fact, let me just give you one illustration of this. How many people in here have a brother or a sister? Okay, question. Is your brother and sister in the same place you are financially, spiritually, personally, academically? Are they? No. You don't get equity from 2 people brought up in the same house from the same parents under the same roof. Right. And yet you're going to force equity for people that aren't even born in the same place under the same. You can't do it without being unjust to so many people. So equity is a fool's errand. We should be for equal opportunity, but not equal outcome. There's 1,000 reasons why people wind up in different places that have nothing to do with discrimination. So you got to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis. I'm just telling you how our system works.
So would you say being like lukewarm is probably...
What's that?
Like lukewarm in politics.
What's lukewarm?
Like just picking and choosing stuff.
Well, I think you should have to pick and choose advisedly. Mm-hmm. And I have a very hard time picking people who are completely anti-God. I don't know how people do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
So C.S. Lewis says that Satan typically sends errors in pairs on parallel tracks, and the tactic is typically you're so distasted by one that you back up into the error on the other side. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's a lot of Christians who are just completely apathetic to politics and to being involved, or at least they're not involved. But yet I have peers who are very concerned about the values, but they see maybe the last couple of decades where Christians has appeared to use politics as almost a shortcut to discipleship. Mm-hmm. If we can just get the right person in office, then we can turn this country around. When change happens from the bottom up, not the top down. So what would you say to those who are serious about their faith and are serious about their issues, but their distaste of politics has put them on this kind of at odds even within themselves in this area?
Well, I would say you have to do both at the same time. You have to bring people up to be disciples, and you also have to, for the greater good, if you care about people other than yourself, and even obviously yourself, you want to put the right people in positions of power because they can change people's lives for good or for ill. Mm-hmm. And so I think you have to do both. If you're disgusted with it as I am, I get that. But that doesn't mean you should just check out. That's the worst thing you can do, right?
Right.
If a patient has a disease, you don't go, I'm just tired of fighting this disease. You go, I got to redouble my efforts.
Yeah.
And giving up isn't the answer.
Right.
Right?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we got just a few more. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Frank.
Yeah, what's your name?
Liam.
Liam, go ahead.
All right, so my question is in regard to the Sabbath commandment. So in Genesis chapter 2, when God finishes creating the world, it says he blessed the Sabbath. He blessed the Sabbath day, the seventh day, and sanctified it. And he did that before there was man, there was Jew, before there was sin in the world. And in Mark chapter 2, when Jesus says Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The word there, man, I believe, is anthropos, which means humanity or mankind. So why do you not believe in keeping the Sabbath anymore?
Because Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, don't let anyone tell you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day.
I think, I believe it also says in that verse, you're no longer required to keep like feast days. In Leviticus, there's mentions of like harvest Sabbaths, like 6 years you'll harvest, and then the 7th year is a Sabbath year of harvest. So I take that, or I see that as being different than the fourth commandment and the 10 Commandments. So how do you?
Well, we'd have to
explain
look
that?
at the passage to see if that's indeed the case. If Paul's talking about another Sabbath other than the fourth commandment Sabbath, but it seems to me that the Sabbath, our rest, has arrived in Jesus. Now, I'm not saying it's not a good idea to take a day of rest, but it's not a commandment anymore. It was a commandment and in the Old Testament, and Jesus actually fulfilled it. And so we rest in him. But friends of mine who are highfalutin people who are always on their phones, they'll shut off their phone all day on Saturday. It's probably a good idea, isn't it? Right? And they won't have any electronics, and they're not Jews. Although one is, like Ben Shapiro. He's not my friend, I just know of him. Ben Shapiro turns everything off, and he, checks out for a day. Probably helpful, particularly in today's culture. Right?
So follow-up question. So why could you not say the same for the other 9 commandments? If Jesus fulfilled those 9 commandments, then why are we obligated to keep those 9 out of love, but not?
Because the other 9 are repeated in the New Testament as obligatory on us, where the fourth one isn't. The fourth one, if I'm interpreting Colossians 2 right, he says, don't let anyone tell you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. All right?
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Appreciate it. All right, final question. Yes, sir. And don't say I got 37 questions.
No, I don't.
What's your name?
Jesse.
Go ahead, sir.
My question is, if you accept Jesus at some point at your life, and at another point you decide to walk away from the faith, do you believe you can lose your salvation?
Say that again. Get a little closer to the mic.
If you accept Jesus into your life, and at a point in your life, like later in life, you walk away from the faith, can you lose your salvation?
Well, the first half of that question, if it were possible for you to accept Jesus, I think once you're saved, you're always saved. But other Christians argue differently. And I think the first half of that, if you accept him, no, you couldn't walk away, because you're sealed with the Holy Spirit. And Jesus says in John chapter 5, he who believes has passed from death into life. Notice he doesn't say you get eternal life when you die. You get eternal life when you believe. And if you get eternal life when you believe, how can you lose it? Right. So, because then it wouldn't be eternal, right? So there are people, though, who say they once believed and now they don't. And what we would say is, well, they never truly believed. Jesus talks about the 4 soils, right? Sometimes the soil sprouts up, but then the plant sprouts up, but then it is burned out by the cares of the day or the heat of the sun, right? There are people that at least initially look like they're saved, but they're really not. So it's similar to, I had a question recently, would we still have free will? Are you taking away our free will? We're with Jesus and now we don't have the freedom to leave. Well, it's similar to marriage. Marriage is an illustration of our union with Christ. When you decide that you're going to marry somebody, you made that free will choice. In a certain sense, now you've given up your free will. When I got married, I don't know about you, but it put a big damper on my dating life, right? I couldn't keep dating other than my wife, because I had driven my free will toward her, and now that free will has been sealed with her. And you say, well, people can get divorced. Yeah, but God doesn't want you to get divorced. I just had that up there, right? He doesn't want you to get divorced. That's the whole point. So there are some choices you make. By making the choice, you've given up a piece of your free will. And it's true in marriage. It's true when you become a Christian. It's true tragically when people commit suicide. There are some choices that negate your free will or fulfill your free will.
Yeah. Thank
All
you.
right?
You're awesome,
Thank you.
by the way. You're awesome.
No, only God's awesome. Thank you. Ryan? Thanks, brother. I'll go back there.
Wow. Well, that was close to 20 to 25 minutes. I think we went 3 times those. This is a fantastic evening. I enjoyed it. I don't know, what about you?